Welcome everyone, and I hope you enjoyed the ads so far. Please download Wiredash, it's a great SDK. I'm here today to talk about records and patterns. This is quite new. These Dart features just dropped with Dart Free, and we are together exploring them. First of all, how do language features actually get created? There is a repository called Dartlang language, and it was created in 2018, so quite a while ago. And it is completely public, so you can follow all the design decisions there. You can create issues like 3,000 of you already did. And today, there's almost 1,000 open issues, meaning we have like over 1,000 ideas how to improve Dart. The Dart team itself will then go through those issues and decide for themselves what they want to implement next and what's the biggest benefit for all of us. And in the beginning, we heard about Flutter and Dart, that there is such a big democracy. And that's really true, because the Dart team is also looking through these issues, sort them by likes. So please go ahead and vote for your favorite language feature. And then they will see what they can implement. In the past, they implemented a few things already. For example, static extension methods in 2.7, null safety, of course, 2.12, type defs, and enums with members. These are the latest additions to the language. And now we have Dart free, and the Dart team did an amazing job and covered a whole ton of those mostly upvoted issues. They are also aware of the rest. We get later to those. But today we will cover records and patterns. That's it. Let's summarize what those features actually are, or what kind of issues are related to them. First of all, we want data classes. This is the #1 upvoted issue at all. Records don't cover this entirely, but halfway. They definitely allow us to return multiple values and allow us to destructure them, and we will come to that later. Pattern matching, on the other hand, is a bit broader. It's mostly about algebraic data types, sealed classes, union types, sum types. They are not entirely solved those issues, but the Dart team try to solve like 90% of them. Also, like the new switch statements, this was also a quite recent issue in this repository, because JDK 12 is not that old, and we get this as well. Let's jump right into records, and then we proceed until we end up at patterns. This is a record of like two integer values. And we can combine multiple values into a single one, and this is called record. Records also can have named arguments. Here it's X and Y. And this is the main difference compared to other languages. If you talk to other languages, they most likely end up calling them tuples, but tuples are by default positional and not named. In Dart, by design, in the first iteration, we already have named arguments. This is why everything is called records. A record can be quite complex. So this here is a record with two positional string arguments and two named A and B. And we can access those fields with the $sign if it's a positional. Note, it starts with a 1, not a 0. And the named arguments, like normal fields on any class, A and B. Let's check out the types, because they are quite interesting. So this is how types look like for positional arguments and for named arguments. And this should be quite familiar to all of you, because this is like functions work. Also for positional arguments, we can add names, but they only have a documentation purpose, no others, nothing else. They look like a function, and they very much behave the same way. They have the same syntax for positional arguments and also for named arguments. And here's the fun part, because I see all of you are quite tired. Nobody's shouting, oh, this doesn't compile. Because, of course, this doesn't compile. This is not a valid Dart function. We are missing the required keyword, of course. And this is a big difference. There is no required keyword on the records. So everything is by default required. And even if we have nullable values, either positional or as named arguments, we can not skip those. We always have to give them a value. In this case, null. Let's look at this more complex one, and let's check the type. If we have such a complex record type, we definitely want to type def it so we can pass it around and use it. For example, we can define a field or a method and pass it inside. It very much behaves like any other object. It's just a record or any other variable. What is generated under the hood? First of all, there is no code generation involved. This is inside of the compiler, but to give you a representation what kind of code is there, I created this example class. First of all, a record always extends the record type. And this is a new type that was introduced and is mostly for code generation, so that if we see code, we know, oh, this is a record, and then we can check further. So as a developer, you don't really have to use it. We have positional arguments, $1, $2, and the named ones as well. We get a nice toString method, and now the interesting part, we get an equals implementation, which is quite good. It checks all the values, and also we have the hash code implementation. So now you have to be a bit careful, because not all objects in Dart support the equal operator correctly. For example, most commonly, lists do not support it. If we have an empty list, that's fine. I think it has the hash code 0 by default, and it is equal to itself, especially if it's const. So comparing those two records with each other, they are equal to each other. But if we put values inside that list, those lists are not equal anymore. They have the same values, yes, and we could compare it with like list equality, but they are not equal. And this check here would fail. There's a solution to that, of course. You can use third-party packages that have lists and collections that do support this. For example, ktdart. Just replace your collections or the Dart collections with ktdart collections, and it will just work as you would like. You can put everything inside a record, for example, functions as well. They are also not equal to each other, so be a bit careful if you rely on the equality. You cannot override it. You have to use what is supported by the language. One cool thing about records is that they are immutable by default. And as someone who does a lot of functional programming, this is like, yes, finally, they understand that immutability is very important. Unfortunately, if you have immutable values or an immutable record, you cannot change values, which would sometimes be very helpful. Instead, you have to create the copy yourself, copy all the parameters inside, and change values if you want. You can create an extension function for your type, so you can create your own copy with methods. And I'm pretty sure that in the next 2 to 3 months, someone will write a build generator, code generator that does this for you. Until now, I used Freest a lot, and Freest has an amazing way to use copy with, even for deeply nested values. This is something we will never get for records. So if you have deeply nested immutable data structures and objects, you still want to use Freest for those. There's an issue for creating copy with, but they explicitly decided this is a feature for data classes later on, which we will eventually get later. Because data classes is still the #1 highly rated issue, and they want to bring this to us in the future together with static metaprogramming. And yeah, we will see how it turns out. Let's talk about the form of a record, or the type. Because form is important. That's everything a record is. It is a form of values or types. So I created this small library here where I have points with an x and y value. Those are named. And if I combine 2 points, I have a line. And if I combine 3 points, I have a triangle, of course. I can create extensions functions for those. And for the line, I can calculate the length and the area for the triangle. Quite easy. We have all done this in school. If I then create a line, which is just a tuple of 2 points, then I can call the length method, and the same thing for a triangle. Looks a bit complicated, but this is just how it works. Now, this is one of the coolest features, and I think nobody mentioned this before. If you are writing your own library, for example, you create your 2D game, you most likely have a type called coordinate. And guess what? They have the same form. A point and a coordinate are the same thing, even though they are living in different libraries. They have no dependency on each other. They have just the same form. This is a record with two named arguments named x and y. And because they have the same form, we can use the extension from the geometry library inside of our game. Pretty cool, isn't it? And I think this will become very handy in the future, because now packages can cooperate with each other without relying on each other. So you don't have to have a dependency on someone just to use their types. You can just create like a contract. This is how our records would look like, and then we can pass it from one library to the other. Pretty cool. Unfortunately, this is a missed opportunity. In the past, in Flutter in 2017, we had a point class. Did someone know this? It was removed, unfortunately, because point and offset are basically the same things. They have an x and a y value, and they were used in the same way. So to combine those, they deleted the point class, and we are now using offset. But I was thinking about this, and sometimes when I write code, it would be very useful to use a point, because it just makes more sense in that context to use points instead of an offset. So if we would have records in the past, this class would not exist. Now let's leave records behind and destructure them. This is another cool feature. So we continue with point and line, and a line is, of course, nothing else than 2 points. And use the values from there. We can even go further and remove the types, because Dart is a statically typed language, records are statically typed, so the compiler knows exactly that A and B are points indeed. We can even go further, because we know a point is just an x and y value named, and we can destructure all of those 4 values at once. I wouldn't write this code, but it is totally possible. Instead, I would probably write something like this. If I only need like 1 value of this, I can destructure only 1 value and assign it. So here I destructure only from the first point the x value, and I can use that. Let's look at this in a bit more detail. So here we have our point, and then we structure it in the long form. So we assign the x getter to the x double, which is in our local scope, the same thing for y. And we can make this a bit shorter, because this is quite a common thing. If you have a record with an x value, you most likely want to call it x in your local code as well. So by writing :x, :y, you can automatically use the x value of that record and assign it to a local variable called x. Going back to this example, we can use it as well. So here we can just write xy to get the x value and print it. And this is one odd thing. I'm also destructuring the y value. Why am I doing this? Because sometimes the compiler has not enough information. And in this case, I cannot not replace it with an underscore, because then the compiler doesn't know exactly what it is. This might be fixed in the future, but right now, sometimes you have to destructure more than you actually want. I leave it up to you if you want to destructure your record or if you just want to access those fields. I personally have this feeling that we should not destructure that much. Are there package authors in this room? Who has a package on pub and supports it? Great. For all of you, this is very important. If you want to support records in the future in your packages, please be very careful what you expose in your public API, because it is very easy to break things. For example, in this serialized double function, where you can it. You cannot change the type or the form of a record. This is a breaking change because people can destructure your record, and whenever you change something, you will break their code. So do not change the types. Definitely do not change the name. You have to be very strict about that. And most importantly, do not add a new argument to a record. And this is very different from before. When you return a class, you can add a new getter or a new field, because this is not a breaking change. This is completely different with records. Records have a form. Once you modify the form in any way, it is a breaking change to your users. So be careful. Let's do a small quiz. Now we know what records are and what destructuring is. So let's look at one pretty cool example. First of all, did you know that you could create a record with just one value? Cool, right? So let's try to think about what is the actual output of this code. Has someone an idea? You? No idea? Okay, it is not easy because the first one is just an integer and the second one is a record of one integer positional value. The difference here is just a comma, and that's something you have to be very careful. The syntax of a record requires at least one comma. It is very easy if you have multiple values, there's always a comma, but for a single value, you have to add it as well. Because the parentheses at the top, they are just syntactic sugar, they are completely ignored, it is just an int value. This is also the same if we add the explicit types. At the top, we have just an integer value. At the bottom, we have this record, but a record requires a comma, so we have this to make it compile. Very interesting, and if you have... Yes, this will not throw an exception and this will not compile. Because the type is not correct. You are here trying to assign a record of int to int. It is not the same thing. Now we learned that. Second quiz. We have an item which we already structured, or we have this record called item. It is still an integer of a record of a single integer. We can now destructure it and assign it to 1 or 2. So the question is, which one is correct? I guess you know it because you always need a comma to tell the compiler that it is a record. So the first one actually destructures, meaning you are not having a record anymore, but you are accessing the value, the first value in that record. And the second one is just remove the parentheses, and it's just an assignment to a new variable. So it stays a record, it is not destructured. Records are pretty cool because they are type safe. And some APIs in the past were not type safe. For example, the famous future.wait, where you can wait for multiple futures to return, and it gives you the values. In the past, it gave you the values as a list of dynamic, and you manually had to cast the results to get the values. In the future, no. Actually, today, you can use a new function. I don't think there's a package out there that yet supports it, but I'm pretty sure someone will create it soon because it is quite straightforward to write. We can write now a method with 2 generic types added as parameters and return a record of those types. So this is completely type safe, and we can call this method and destructure the results right away. Pretty cool, no manual casting anymore, no errors once you use a library that supports it. We destructured so far only records, but destructuring is something that works for all kinds of objects. So first of all, lists. We can finally destructure lists. So here we only want to have the first argument or the first element in a list, and we can write code like this. It assigns the first element to first, and then we can use that variable in that scope. Also, the spread operator at the end is required. This is just the rest parameter, and you have to define it. Otherwise, this will not compile. This gives us another cool thing. We can not only access the first one, we can also access the last one and the previous to last one. however you like. It just has to match this pattern and then assigns the variables automatically. But you have to be very careful. Lists do not always have two values. List might be empty or only have one value. And if it doesn't fit the form, if it doesn't matches the pattern, you will get a runtime exception. So I think in the future we will have like lint rules that might catch those errors. But right now, this is valid code. You can write it, but at runtime it will just crash with this pattern matching error. It doesn't give you much information, so it's pretty hard to see what's actually going wrong. But don't do this. Instead, you have to check manually for the length before. We can also destructure maps. So we had lists. It also works for maps. And we can extract single keys of that map. Pretty cool. That might be very handy if you are parsing some JSON manually. I was thinking like, now we have lists, we have maps. What about sets? It should be possible, right? No, actually not. It's completely impossible because sets by default are unordered. They don't have named arguments, so we cannot use those. And they are unordered, so we cannot have like an index to access those values. So sets are unfortunately not supported, although that would be very cool. But what is supported is like normal objects. Any objects you have already in your code can be destructured to get the values and assign it to variables right away. Here I created a burger, and at the very top, at the very bottom, I'm destructuring it. So final burger, and then I use the name parameter and assign it to burger name. This is quite verbose and super strange. When I saw it the first time, I was like, oh, why is someone calling a constructor there? Super weird, but this is something you have to get used to. This is out in the wild. You can use it with Dart free, and you will see it all over the place in the future. So you have to get used to it. You can make it a bit easier. So if you are not assigning it to a variable called burger name, but instead you want to use the variable name, you can write the shorthand like this and destructure it to that. What about partially destructuring? So far, or this is something that is very common in the JavaScript on TypeScript world. If you are using hooks in React, for example, you can use state, and sometimes you only want the getter, the count getter. Sometimes you also want to expose the setter and actually use it, but you don't have to. So you can write code like this, and both types are totally fine. If you try to do the same with Dart and basically want to copy the syntax, we cannot do this. We always have to use the spread operator with lists. And Remy already created an issue for this because it is totally unnecessary and it shouldn't be that way. Let's see if this is fixed in the future. What about records? Because lists are not type safe. We would still have to manually cast those. Records, on the other hand, are type safe, so we could get the actual types. But there still we have to use the wildcard as a placeholder for values we don't want. This gets super annoying if you have a record with like 10 arguments. Then you have to use underscore, 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 underscore. And we are quite lucky that we can use a single underscore multiple times. In some other APIs, for example, in functions, we have to use underscore, 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 and so on and so forth. Because we can also destructure objects, I think this is right now the best solution. It gives us best of both worlds. And so we have a state object here. It exposes a getter for the count. It exposes a getter for the function set state, and we can partially destructure it. So we don't have to use any placeholder. We can just define what we actually want from that object. It's super annoying that we have to write state in the beginning, but there's also a ticket in the language repository that we might eventually do not have to write this anymore because this is just too verbose. Now, let's leave records more or less behind and destructuring. Let's go to pattern matching. And I think this is maybe the coolest feature in the addition to Dart in a long time. In the past, when you wrote a switch case statement, like a classic switch case statement in Dart 2, it looks like this. We have a burger type. This is something maybe a person tells you, and you have to match the correct burger. The first thing we notice is that there is a break. We don't need this anymore. This was removed with the new syntax. Cool. Let's continue with adding more cases. And this is new. This wasn't possible before. Beforehand, you had to write cases in a new line if you want to match them as well. You can now chain them together as you want with AND and OR operators. Everything is possible. Great addition, but the next thing that is super annoying is with this syntax, you have to assign this value multiple times. You have to write burger all over the place. Pretty annoying. But there's a language feature that we know from the past, which is the immediately invoked function expression. Many people have not seen this, but I use it all over the place. And it's basically an anonymous function that is executed right away and returns a value. And this is why I can use the return statements here, and it assigns it directly to the variable burger, which only exists once now. Pretty cool. Now let's see what the new switch expression looks like. This is a completely new feature in Dart 3, and it is quite short. I quickly switch back. This is the old version you had to write. This is the new version. Great, we saved like 3 lines of code. Let's see them side by side. And I want you to look at every detail and try to find the differences, because there are quite a lot. Let's go through them one by one. First of all, switch. The old switch, or I don't want to call it old because this is still valid Dart code and it's not better than the new switch expression. So we have switch case and we have switch expression. Both are fine. But one of them has no return value. This is the switch we know so far. And the new one has a return value. This is pretty cool. And we want to use it a lot. But sometimes you don't want to return something. You just want to match something, which is kind of hard because there's this weird case that you cannot write the new switch from the switch expression at the beginning of a line. There was some ambiguity in the language design, and they decided that it's not allowed to write switch at the beginning of the line. There has to be something beforehand. One workaround is to wrap it in parentheses, and then you can use it. Cool. The next thing is that the switch case has cases, whereas the switch expressions has no cases. It has just expressions. The switch case has colons to separate the patterns from the values, and the new one, the switch expression, uses the arrows. The old one uses default, the new one uses an underscore. The old one uses uses semicolons, the new one uses commas. The old one did not require anything at the end. The new one does require a semicolon at the end. The old one allowed us to write multiple lines. The new one doesn't allow us to write multiple lines. Here we have to use the immediately invoked function expression again. So they are quite different. It is very, very hard to switch between them. And if you write code manually, this is super annoying because of multi-line code, you have to switch to the one or to the other because you want to return something. You have to use the what is it called? Immediately invoked function expression in either the one on the left or either the one on the right. It is super annoying to switch between them. Also, they have different features. The one has a return value, the other doesn't. So it is very hard for humans. And I don't want to see, when I'm pair programming, I don't want to sit with someone who's not familiar with the syntax, like typing 5 minutes until the syntax is correct to switch from one to the other. Super annoying. I don't know why they did this. And I would prefer it just from someone using it if they would have introduced a new keyword like match. There were discussions like this, and I don't understand why they have not chosen to do this, because this also confuses code completions and GitHub Copilot, for example. When I generate code with Copilot or ChatGPT and so on and so forth, I usually now get a switch case statement, which is neither the one nor the other. It is just not valid Dart code. So this is super annoying, and I don't know how to resolve this. Let's see what we can do. So leave the syntax aside. Let's see what we can actually do with the new switch expression. We can match different types. If you ever work with a file system, you never exactly know what you get. Either you get a directory or you get a file. we can now use the switch statement to switch those, and depending on the type, so here we are checking the type, we can execute either the one or the other part of the code. We can also automatically destructure. So for the directory, we destructure the path and can use it in our cases directly. We can also use guards, which is pretty cool. I don't want to go too deep into it, but if you destructure a value, you can also use the when expression and then do some arithmetic expressions with it to see if this is really true. So here in this example, I want to print something different for an absolute file. Now I can do it. If it doesn't match, because this absolute is false, it goes to the next matcher and sees, oh, it's a file, so I print relative file. Personally, I wouldn't probably use the switch expression here. I think this code is absolutely fine, and because I personally know that there's only a file or a dictionary, it cannot be anything else, this code is most likely shorter and also correct. Sealed classes are the latest shit. And I used them in the past with Freezed a lot. One fun story in the past, a product owner came to me and asked me, why is this login page taking you so long to implement? And I was like, oh, I can tell you. Let's look at my definition of my classes here. For every login, I have like 14 different type of results I have to handle. So multiply this by like half a day, and then you can see it takes quite a lot of time. And I can really show this in code. So here are 14 cases. I have to handle all of those. And we can do this right now with sealed classes. Because sealed classes are cool because they are locked to the number of classes you can create. You can create as many as you want, but not outside of your library. Nobody else is seeing the login result interface can extend it except for the code you have here. And this gives the compiler the opportunity to check the cases you have. So if you switch the result and you match those cases, the compiler can know, oh, actually you caught all the possible cases. Why do you even have an underscore at the end, a wildcard matcher? You don't need it, you can just remove it. On the other hand, if you add a new case, you will get red code everywhere in your switch expressions all over the project where you're using that type because you are not anymore handling all the cases. So it's pretty cool that you're not missing something. Comparing this to Freezed is a bit sad because I personally think that the Freezed on the left here, on the right here, is still a better syntax. It is shorter, and I personally like it a bit more than the switch case expression. Yeah, but that's how it is. I don't want to add freeze to every project, every package I have, so I'm pretty sure that I will use the sealed classes many, many times. Now we talk about the if case, because pattern matching is something that not only works with switch, but also with the new if case. So here I wrote an application that gets me the SD cards from all my from my MacBook. And when I have a SD card while launching my application, I can select it automatically and start discovering the photos on the SD card. I can do the same thing with a matcher or the if case. So here I know it is a list and I want to match that when I have a single item. And now I match this case, and only if I have a single item, I can directly assign it to the variable card and use the variable later on. It saves me a line and it's quite cool, but you can also guard it with the when clause, and then you can make it quite complex. And it is, again, up to you if you want to use if case or if you want to have nested ifs. It's just a decision. Do you want to have wide code with long lines of code, or do you want to have long code? It's completely up to you. The last thing I want to show you is matrix matching, and this is something that can be very handy if you have a lot of like Boolean parameters, and sometimes they are not valid because of some other Boolean parameters and you have to check them. What you can do is you can create a record of all those Boolean parameters and then match those Boolean parameters. And if you do, you make sure that you are not leaving out any case. Here, if you would forgotten the wildcard at the end for the unknown status, you would get a pretty good error message that you actually forgot the case where all 3 values are false, and so on and so forth. If you forget something, you get all the different ways that the matcher is not matching or the switch case is not matching. You get this as a list, and you can see exactly what's missing, what cases you have to handle as well. Let's go back to the list of Dart features. So we now have records and patterns. Let's see what else is missing. What are the highest rated issues here? We talked already about data classes. They will probably end up being released with static metaprogramming. I personally would not bet to be them released in the next 2 years. So this is quite a long time, but they are still working on it, but it is a big feature. Optional semicolons is highly rated, but it basically gives us no real value. In fact, if we would remove semicolons, parsing of our Dart code would be slower, and we would have longer compile times. And I think adding a semicolon here and there is quite fine. Static extension methods is something that is highly rated and probably a low-hanging fruit. So I expect this to land soon. Soon as in at least a year. And the shorter enum syntax, so that you don't have to write the type of the enum, but only the dot value at the end. This is something that is probably coming soon as well for pattern matching, because we can match enums as well, and it's quite handy to get a shorter version there. I'm a big fan of sometimes. I use freezed a lot, and I like sometimes in TypeScript, for example. And I just want to show you what could be possible in the future if you get like real sum types. And for example, if you have the padding widget, you could say, oh, this is a num, or it is an edge insert geometry. So you could just write padding 8, and we all would know what it actually means, and it would be type safe. This is something that was not covered by the records and patterns thing. This is also why sum types is not a closed issue. This is still something that the team eventually wants to add, and I would be a huge fan if this lands. Because with the sealed classes, you can only create new classes. You cannot combine existing classes from different packages. So what is our mission after we explored patterns and records? First of all, we have to get used to the syntax. There's a lot to learn, and you have to learn it. There's no way around it. This is part of the official SDK. Please create issues and also ask a lot of questions. If you ask the questions today, the juniors of tomorrow will find it. So please ask it. And also, I think we all know that ChatGPT is learning from Stack Overflow. So let's help each other and create issues about the new syntax. Records and patterns are not covered by effective Dart, which is quite interesting. And the reason for that is that effective Dart only covers best practices. But because those features are so new, there are not really best practices. And it's on us as a community to find best practices, to raise your hand if there is a way we can have a better syntax and create issues for this. Please, 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 those are new features. Don't overuse it. It sometimes makes the code very hard to read. Use it with caution. Thank you very much.